Now, first we're going to do some review for Galatians 2. We're going to review some of Acts. A lot of these names that we studied in Acts last year. First off, we're going to remember Barnabas. Remember the name Barnabas, which means son of encouragement. He became a Christian. He used to be a Jew named Joseph. And I've been calling him Barney, just for the fun of it, because one of my heroes was named Barney, if you ever watched the Flintstones.
Barney Fife.
That was another Barbie. Yeah. We'll speak more on Barney later. And then we'll remember how we studied how Timothy used to be called Titus. That's a recent theory, and I think it's pretty good theory. How he was lovingly renamed by Paul as Timothy. And that's something I showed you back in Acts 16. And we'll expand on Timmy a bit later too. Next, let's remember that Peter used to be called Simon before he met Jesus. And Jesus lovingly renamed him Cephas, which means rock. And very soon after that, that Aramaic name of Cephas was translated into the Greek name of Petros, a name which much, much later our English lazily transliterated into Peter. And that's sort of like the same history for our translation of James. James' name originally was Jacob. And that was translated into Jacobus in the Greek, and that later became James in the English. Now, that all leads us to the first puzzle. The first puzzle of Galatians 2 was, how come the name Peter and Cephas are back-to-back in verses? Why didn't they use the same verse, the same name back-to-back when they mean the same person? You'll see in verses 8 and 9, both the name Peter and Cephas are used differently. In your old NIV, they both say Peter. However, in this one, it's more accurate. One says Cephas and one says Peter. Why? Is that just to confuse us? No, the NIV is being more accurate now. It's trying to give you a little more depth. It's trying to give you a little more explanation. So, the NIV is not trying to confuse you. Paul is using different names in a different context, making it even more clear to us that this Peter is the very same person that Jesus named Cephas. And Paul is making his apostolic identity, his being an apostle, even more clear to his Galatian readers. This was that Paul. This was that Peter. That was this Cephas. And he is conceding through that name, through that inclusion, that even Cephas, even the rock, can crumble under pressure. And Peter did crumble under pressure. Again, that's why you see two different names going on here. It was for more explanation. That's the answer to that puzzle, if you have been curious about why there's two different names there. Now, you'll also see that Jesus' given name of Cephas doesn't give him any greater authority at all. We can see that in verse 9. We can see that James actually had more authority than Peter did. One of the indications is that James is listed first among three people. That makes a difference. When you're listed first, that generally gives you greater authority. When you're listed first in English or Greek, you are generally of more importance. And now, Paul was insisting that it was the full Jerusalem Council that was used to decide a very sensitive issue here. It was the full Jewish council that was used to decide a very sensitive issue. The issue of whether or not Gentile Christians must be circumcised or not. They were to decide on whether or not Titus, the half-breed, because he's part Jewish and part Greek, was he to be circumcised or not. And they were going to decide on whether Paul was delinquent in his gospel, whether his gospel was lacking something, whether he was presenting the right gospel. They decided. And then Paul relates that it was that fully circumcised council who ruled in favor of the foreskin. They ruled in favor of keeping it. Who ruled in favor of the gospel of grace that Paul was presenting. Who ruled in favor of Paul's gospel and his ministry to the uncircumcised. Not that they were an infallible counsel or anything. They were still fallible. Paul also had reasons why he was right, and we presented them earlier. So then, after that liberating ruling by the council, woohoo, we all don't have to get circumcised. Whether Titus got circumcised or not is neither here nor there. As we had seen in chapter 16 of Acts, we see that Titus likely got circumcised later, regardless of that ruling. And he got circumcised for reasons that I suggested. There were many reasons why he may have gotten circumcised. And one of the main ones was that his body modification honored God. His intentions honored God. And how about that? That's what Timothy actually means. It means honored God. Timoth means honor Theo God. Timothy. So, in the end, Titus lost a bit to become a Timbit. Okay, I got a giggle. But to clarify things a bit, verse 3 may be very easily understood to be saying, yet not even Titus, my dear and faithful Timothy, who was with me, was compelled to be circumcised, either by me or by counsel. That little end part there, I added. It is something called a paraphrastic construction, and I don't think it would be an invalid construction. I think that's how the readers would have understood it, because that was the issue. Paul was defending himself there. And that would have been an awkward way of speaking, however. So Paul probably didn't actually say those words, and Gaius copied down exactly what Paul did say. And he was copying it down, you remember, for his dearly departed brothers in Derbe of Galatia, the province of Galatia. He was copying it down for those goofy Galatians. And that should clear up that puzzle for you. Why did Paul circumcise Timothy but not Titus? Well, the current theory is they were actually the same person. I think it's a good theory. So we'll see what we can get to in what the issue was actually about here in Galatia. Because there was another issue. It was not about circumcision. What do we see Paul actually disputing with Peter, Cephas, happening here in Galatians, in Antioch? What was actually happening in that chapter? What was that mystery all about? It is a mystery. I'm going to speculate here. So, we know that the issue was not circumcision in Antioch. That issue was over and done with. They got the memo from the Jerusalem Council. They knew what it was about. However, that issue was just beginning for the Galatians. Maybe those visitors had just come up from Jerusalem. They're from Antioch and were now harassing Galatia. Maybe it seems they got sent away by James. They got kicked out because they were divisive. So, Paul explains the circumcision aspect of that memo to those Galatians, for those Galatians. But the more important, he explained the grace paradigm. Remember, the gospel of grace, this chapter is all about this. This book is all about grace. This is our theme here. He explained the gospel of grace for those Galatians. And just so those Galatians weren't feeling singled out, he's saying, yes, they messed up in Antioch as well. They had similar graceless thinking in Antioch, which was where they were first called Christians. Thanks, Barry. Nice. So, he informs those Galatians of his opposing Cephas, Peter, his support of a different subversive custom in Antioch. He was opposing Cephas in support of a Jewish eating custom. We see eating custom being mentioned in verses 12 to 14 in this chapter. He was opposing a custom that was happening here. A custom that was being promoted by those visitors that Cephas was afraid of. Cephas was crumbling before these Jewish visitors. And from the text, it doesn't seem that he was endorsing the kosher food. Remember what kosher food is? Kosher food is something Jews are not allowed to eat. No cud, no eat is a rule. If your animal doesn't have a cud, you cannot eat it. Because Cephas knew that kosher trick pretty well by now. Remember, he'd been impressed upon it a few times in Acts 11, 10, 15. He knew that trick, so he didn't get smoked by that one again. It was a custom that was being impressed upon him. So, it may have been a custom that all the priests were permitted smoked meat and fat-free meat. Yeah, that's weird, eh? Where did that come from? I thought that was just a modern day custom. Oh, yeah, everything has to be fat-free. No. It was a custom back then that some of their meat would be fat-free for the priests. Way back in Leviticus, all the fat was cut off, and the priests were given smoked, fat-free meat. So perhaps Cephas was flattered and said, yeah, okay, I'm a priest of sorts, so I should be entitled to this smoked, fat-free meat as well. And Barney as well was also smoked. He was also a priest, you may remember, at one point. So it seems he got smoked as well until Paul exposed them as hypocrites. You are wrong. That's not the gospel. And other Jews in Antioch were joining that hypocrisy. Why? Perhaps they were priests of some sort as well, from the Levitical tribe. Ooh-wee. So they were, and the other Gentiles, Christian Gentiles, were being forced to support them. Well, we have to bring them fat-free meat. We have to bring our priests smoked meat. And they were being forced to present that to the priests. They were forced. Just like we are being forced to humor homosexuals today. We are being forced. We are not being compelled. We are being forced. And that is a word that you will see in verse 14 of your quiz book. Forced. It's highlighted. It should also be in verse 3. That word compelled should not be there. The word is forced. Unfortunately, many translations miss the active force of forced, including the King James Version. Forced. And they prefer the passive word of compelled instead. But we see here, it's very clear that they were compelled, and Peter was afraid. Why would you be afraid if you were just compelled? No. Forced. They were afraid. Cephas the rock was afraid. So, Paul concludes this chapter by appealing to those fearful Galatians. Appealing to them to fear not. And return to the gospel of grace. And then he finally he uses a type of logic that in the Latin is called reductio ad absurdum. And he concludes reducing their graceless gospel to an absurdity. He says it's a gospel for dum-dums. He says, if grace was not the case, your Christ died for nothing. Nothing whatsoever. And that lets them ponder, just how absurd could our Christ possibly be if he died for nothing? Okay. Well, I'll pray now.